Okay, sorry. So let me share the screen back, right? So we're talking about the Iberian Peninsula. We're talking about the Jews of the Iberian Peninsula and about how it's going back and forth between Christians and Jews, Christians and Muslims, and how Jews get into positions of power during this time, but they're still vulnerable to the occasional violence and popular uprising. Okay, so this is a quote from Hillel Halkin's book on Yehuda HaLevi, right? In HaLevi's time, Spain was divided into two roughly equal halves of the frontier that, though slowly shifting in the Christians' favor, and this we'll get to when we get to the life of Yehuda HaLevi, swung frequently back and forth in accordance with local wars and battles. Right, the Iberian Peninsula was a frontier of battlefields during this time, and that's really important for understanding who Yehuda HaLevi is and the way that he sees the world. Right, so there were Muslim enclaves in Christian territory, Christian enclaves in Muslim territory, large Muslim and Christian populations governed by rulers of the opposite faith. Right, I'm going to skip his little thing about El Cid here, right? So getting to Jacob's question, such conditions dictated prudence toward, and as far as possible, normal relations with one's intermittent enemies, right? When you're constantly, this is an interesting insight that he has here. Like when you're constantly on, ever shifting battle between two sides, you kind of want to remain on normal relations as much as possible because you don't know where it's going to shift tomorrow. What did I put here? Right. And then from this state of affairs, Jews tended to profit. The smallest of Spain's three religious groups, they were not directly involved in Christian Muslim warfare, which made them more dependable in Christian Muslim eyes than Christians and Muslims considered one another. There's like an old joke about a guy getting a Jewish guy in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. Like, are you Protestant or Christian? I'm Jewish. And I forgot what the punchline is, but like,
The guy says, "Okay, but are you a Protestant Jew or a Catholic
oh
Jew?"
yeah, there's the punchline. Yeah, okay. So similar kind of thing going on here with like sectarian violence and Jews being seen as like more dependable than the other guy, but that will bite you in the long run when you're also seen as a fifth column, right? Although Christian and Muslim rulers rarely appointed members of the other faith to political administrative positions, they had no such qualms about Jews. So we tend to, get into positions of power. And because we're, cultural middlemen, we could, negotiate this until we don't. So a good microcosm of Iberian Jewry during this time is Shmuel Hanagid. How many people have heard of Shmuel Hanagid here? Okay, because he's actually pretty interesting. So he's born into a wealthy family in 993. He's son of the head rabbi of Cordoba, but once the Caliphate of Cordoba falls in 1013, he ends up in Granada. Okay, Granada. I don't know. Look at a map. Okay, I probably should have looked at a map, but whatever. So he eventually becomes vizier of Granada in general. He is a first-rate political mind. He's also a general. He is one of the only Jews in the entire history of the diaspora who had military power, which is kind of an amazing fact if you think about it for 5 seconds. Like he's the only person in the 2000 years of diaspora who has like positive things to say about war. Because he was like a general. He writes poetry about war, right? And which will lead into another thing. Okay, so he leads the Spanish community. Part of what that means is that he asserts halachic independence from the Gaonim. He wants the Spanish community to be respected as its own community, which I think is a larger plot in world Jewish history, but that's whatever, right? Also writes a lot of poetry, which is the importance of which we're going to get to in a second. So he is as powerful as a Jew can be in the entire history of the diaspora, probably the most powerful Jew uh, until maybe the state of Israel. Um, he's succeeded by his son Yosef, who apparently was not as skilled as a political maneuverer as his father, because in 1066, a mob crucifies him and massacres Granada's Jews. Just goes to show you, like, the heights that Jews could ascend to also had their also I don't want to say also had their downsides as well, but like could just as easily slip into a reason to back them up against the wall and crucify them. Because like, oh, you're the person in power, and we don't like what you're doing, and we don't like how the government is doing, so we're going to blame you for it and blame the Jews, who are the recipients of your largesse, because like this guy was supporting the entire Jewish community, right? Again, look around you in the world today. It's uncomfortable. Okay. This is why I am interested in learning it. Okay. So now let's talk about the culture of Andalusian Jewry. Okay. So again, modern Orthodox, when like modern Orthodox people are looking to history to justify like being modern Orthodox, this is a time period that they look back to, because this is a time period in which there's a sophisticated education, befitting Arabic cultural norms. They are integrated into society. They are not, and it's not that they're religiously lax. They are, very religious, though we'll see there's some complications there, but like they get a rigorous education. Sfarad had its own education system, which was not true of Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz teachers did not get paid. Sephardi teachers had a school system. Sfarad had a school system, right? They taught them Arabic poetry, math, science, philosophy, rhetoric, right? They taught them like a liberal arts education, um, right? And part of that was learning how to be an elite in Arabic culture, right? So they dressed, they behaved, they valued the same things the elite value, right? Did I have anything else to say about this? So a corollary of this is that they looked at Christian Europe Jews as being hicks. Like, you don't even know how to write Arabic poetry. How dare you tell me how to live my life, right? Um, I wanted to look into like, because I do remember reading stuff about how there may have been a similar thing to modern Orthodox communities and Haredi communities in terms of like, well, they just produce better Torah scholars than we do, so we have to rely on them for psak. That actually does not appear to have been the case. Like they were very independent in terms of their psak. Like the Rif is the head of the yeshiva in Spain during this time. His student, the Ri Magash, will end up teaching Maimon, who's going to become the Rambam. The Rambam is going to be a different standard bearer of the history of Andalusian Jewry, but we'll get to that. Okay. Right. So Spain was undoubtedly a great. This is from a book about the poet, the Circle of Poets around Yehuda HaLevi, by Anne Brenner. Okay. So this is a quote from Ezra Fleischer. To surprise those accustomed to the more traditional type of Jewish scholar, Spain was undoubtedly a great center of Torah study, and its academies were known the world over. The great sages of Al-Andalus, that's what it is in Arabic, play an important role in the history of Jewish law. Many members of this great community no doubt devoted their energy to traditional studies, words, not wording. Okay. Nevertheless, the educated classes did not shy away from secular studies. They combined an amazing knowledge of Torah and Jewish law with no less amazing knowledge in the secular branches of learning. Many of these scholars belonged to the upper classes, and their opinions, attitudes, and lifestyle were no different from anyone else around them. Right. So the important thing there is that they got a well-rounded education, which made them cultural elites as part of the upper classes. These were not middle class. These were not middle class or lower class people, right? If there were, they were supported by the community, because like there was one really rich guy, but kind of similar to how the modern Orthodox community operates. There was a investment in the community in being being part of the cultural elite, in going to a good, going to a good college, getting your degree, right? So let's talk about poetry, because this is going to lead right into Yehuda HaLevi. So poetry was always important to Arab
Sorry,
culture.
excuse me. Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
Akiva. Can you on your screen? Can you click the slide at the top of the toolbar, because then it'll be larger and we can see it more clearly.
Why did it take you guys so long to tell me to do that? How did I forget to do that? Okay, guys, interrupt me.
But you had it on in the beginning. It just switched. Yeah. Thank you. Perfect.
It's fine. Okay. So Arab culture has always valued poetry. Look, people do things for fun, right? And in the desert, and you're where Arab culture is from, you're sitting around a campfire or whatever. What do? You either look at the stars, that's where astronomy comes from, or you start writing poetry, like the same way the Iliad evolved, right? And this, there's a culture that values poetry, right? So in Arabic Andalusian culture, right, now that they're like out of the desert, they've conquered all this land, they have these castles, there's a specific context in which poetry gets recited. And a lot of this is like improvised poetry, but it gets written down later. So you're a dude, you have the good life, maybe you're a king, maybe you're a prince, maybe you're a friend of a prince, maybe you're the Jewish vizier of the king, right? You're out in a garden with all these nice ornamental plants, which you've paid a lot of money for, and you're drinking wine with your buddies. Now, were you supposed to be drinking wine with your buddies as a Muslim? No, you were not. But that's where poetry gets recited. And again, one of the ingredients in this pot that is Andalusia, that is the Iberian Peninsula, is Muslims from other places coming like, hey, you guys have gotten soft, right? So they're served by androgynous boys. That's part of it, and reciting poetry about how much you love your buddies, and also you're reciting poetry about how much you love your buddies, and that there's one guy who's the king, or like the person who everybody needs to impress, right? So you write like long poems flattering this person, and then there's a little competition between members of the party as to who's the favored one because of the poetry, the skill of the poet, right? So there's like informal poetry competitions between friends, right? So let's skip. Okay. So other activities of the boon companions. This is also from the book about his poetic circle of poets. Depending on the character of the individual king and the nature of his court, and we meet them in a variety of contexts: playing chess, carousing over wine, hunting in the field, even whipping up dishes in the king's own kitchen. But in 11th century Al-Andalus, perhaps the place we most often meet them is the nightly drinking sessions held in the palace, intimate gatherings with the ruler himself presiding as host, right? Choicest of wines, most beautiful of androgynous cupbearers. We're going to talk about that briefly. During the latter decades of the 11th century to be the quintessential sign of Taifa kingship and nobility, right? So you've got your city-state, you've got your nice castle, you got your garden, you got your buddies drinking wine, right? So they recite in the intimate settings, blah, blah, blah. The boon companions recited their poems or improvised them on the spot. Slave girls sang a word I'm not going to try to pronounce to the strains of music, and one and all debated the merits of various poems or reeled off exemplary verses on given topics. To a certain type of dude, that's a good time, right? I would also say to a certain type of lady, but they were not usually invited, right? So luxury and elegance, a lot of these poems are about how luxurious and elegant things are, right? So anyway, go into the next slide. Okay, so that was describing what it was like in Muslim culture, right? So the thing is about Jewish culture during this time, it's an imitation of elite culture, right? So first of all, it's fine to drink wine, you're good, right? But you still have that sort of competition between the young one, the young upstarts and the older guy, right? The vizier sort of ends up becoming his own sort of monarch in the Jewish community, right? Attended, so you've got musicians playing, lasted all night, much wine being consumed, Quran's prohibition of which was widely disregarded by the Muslims of HaLevi's age, right? Whoever collapsed in the course of them, to judge by the literary evidence, lay where he fell until ready to resume drinking. Shmuel HaNagid has left us with a poignant vignette of a homoerotic counter that took place at such an affair at Crescent Moon was fading in the first light of day. Remember, I mentioned the androgynous cupbearers, right? That's a theme in Arabic culture, in Arabic poetry of the time. And there is a debate as to whether that was indicative of a reality or it was just a poetic form. I don't know. I think that I tend to think where there's smoke, there's fire. So whatever. And Yehuda HaLevi is one of those poets writing about homoerotic encounters. Now, it should be mentioned that you'll sometimes, like, the cool Rebbe will sometimes mention, like, yeah, Yehuda HaLevi wrote secular love poetry. And if he's really cool, he'll mention, like, about guys. More boys than guys. That's part of this too. Okay? That's yeah. Anyway, so there's that in the culture. Okay.
A lot of this sounds like very reminiscent of Greek and Roman culture, where they
Yes.
had their philosophical after dinner parties.
And there may have been
young boys,
because Greek philosophy is catching on during this time. I haven't seen any source that says this explicitly, but like that may have been part of it. There's like, I remember I took a course on Islam in YU in college, and there was this and like it was about like heretical sects in Islam, and we had to look at this, we had to look at this book of heresies and pick a heresy and use and try out put on our academic hats and try to figure out if it was a real accusation. And I tried to find the most crazy heretical thing that I could think of, like the most ridiculous thing. And there was like this ceremony being described that they put a young boy in front of a bunch of people and said, "Oh, we want to have you, oh young boy," and like drink wine in front of him, and like and then the young boy was like taken away or whatever, and was like to represent the unattainability of like God or whatever. And I did this because I wanted to see like the most ridiculous thing that people could come up with when they think that other people are heretics. And then using the critical tools that was given to me by the professor, I was like, actually, this seems to have been real. And I remember the professor was impressed because I remember every compliment that a teacher gives me because I'm still that guy. Some of you may be able to relate that it was real. There have been like actual like academic research into this, that it was a real thing that happened. So like there was this idea of like a boy being unattainable in a way because of the prohibition involved. Whether that slipped into that prohibition being violated, they were drinking wine, which they were not supposed to do. Gay people have probably existed for about a lot longer than the past 150 years. It is like, I don't see any reason to doubt that sometimes this stuff happened. Okay. So Jews wanted their own version of this. So they started, besides their, getting involved in writing Arabic poetry and going to those sort of like salons or whatever, they started writing Hebrew poetry. And this is interesting and actually significant for Yehuda HaLevi, because he's going to be the master of this. But it's interesting how this gets started because it tells you a lot about the Iberian Jewish community. Okay, so they started writing Hebrew poetry and books on Hebrew grammar, and they start incorporating themes of love and wine hesitantly at first. So Hillel Halkin, in his book on Yehuda HaLevi, sort of tracks how this goes on. So Chazdai ibn Shaprut is like the first guy to become like a vizier in Andalusia and become like, one of these guys, one of these gavirs, for lack of a better term, right? And he starts writing love poetry sort of hesitantly. He writes like a love poem, and then he says, And then her parents found out. And then I, was embarrassed and I felt like a girl and I ran away. And, he starts writing wine poetry and then he's like, but don't drink wine, kids. It's bad for you, right? But then you get to Shmuel HaNagid. And Shmuel HaNagid is like very powerful and a general. And he's like, I'm going to write love poetry and wine poetry, and nobody's going to be able to stop me because I'm Shmuel HaNagid. Sure enough, he did. Nobody stopped him, right? And over time, like these become acceptable forms of artistic expression in Hebrew poetry, despite the fact that it's secular, despite the fact that it's specifically not for liturgy, right? Just writing poems about how much fun it is to hang out with the boys drinking wine, or like how how much in love you are with the daughter of the king over the next kingdom, even though you've never talked to her, which apparently was the norm at the time because you're not supposed to talk to the girl before you get married. Okay, so Chazdai Ibn Shaprut is the beginning of this like revival of Hebrew in order to be part of Arabic elite culture and start reciting poetry. But what happens next is really interesting. Okay, so Chazdai has a secretary named Menachem Ibn Saruk. Okay, so he writes a book on Hebrew grammar that was commissioned by Chazdai, and Dunash Ibn Librat writes a critique of it. This guy, Dunash Ibn Librat, he is most famous today for writing the Zemer on Shabbos Jewry Yikra. Okay, how many people know Jewry Yikra? Okay, right. So, because I'll show you something about him in a second, right? So, according to Halkin, and I have no way of judging this, his critiques are actually accurate. Menachem Ibn Saruk didn't quite know what he was doing, and Dunash Ibn Librat was like way beyond him for whatever reason. I got to take Hillel Halkin's word for it, right? But Menachem hits back by attacking Dunash's use of Arabic meter and rhyme in his poetry. Okay? So here's the thing. Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme. Before you get to Sfarad, Hebrew poetry doesn't rhyme. If you look at poetry in Tanakh, it is parallel intensifying couplets. Like, trying to think of a line that I should know off the top of my head, but whatever. Look at Talem sometime. It's like you have one line and then it repeats in the next line in a more intense way, right? We have never rhymed up until the golden age of Spain. So Menachem attacks Dunash because he can't attack him for anything else. Because he can't attack him on the grammar, he attacks Dunash for making Hebrew more Arabic than Hebrew, right? For assimilating Hebrew into Arabic meter and rhyme. There is in Jewry Yikra, Ne'im Shimchem V'lo Yishpat. Apparently, it's if you actually follow Hebrew grammar, it's supposed to be Ne'im or something like that. You see his adoption of Arabic meter, of Arabic grammar, Arabic meter, right? So this was what really was going on here was a proxy debate about secular culture. Like, is it valid to see Hebrew as, it is a Semitic language, but like within the norms of Arabic grammar, Arabic culture, Arabic whatever, or should it be seen as a language in its own right with its own modes of expression, right? So Chazdai decides in Dunash's favor. In other words, Menachem, despite the fact that I made you, write this whole grammar dictionary, right? Actually, you can't attack using Arabic rhyme and Arabic meter and Arabic grammar in Hebrew because, like, buddy, I do that. And he comes down hard on Menachem, okay? No doubt followed by a keen audience. So they have like an exchange of like poetry dissing each other because, that's what you do, right? This exchange might have continued had not Chazdai put a summary end to it. One Shabbat morning, he arrives at Menachem's home with a crew of goons armed with pickaxes and sledgehammers, made a shambles, and dragged Menachem off to jail, where he was left to languish with no formal charges filed against him. A letter that Menachem managed to send to Chazdai, asking to know what he was accused of, received the gnomic reply, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, whatever. If you have done wrong, I have chastised you justly. And if you have done no wrong, I have delivered you to the world to come. Poetry mattered to the Andalusian Jews. Like a lot. Like beat up a guy on Shabbos and imprison him a lot. Okay? Because this was their entree into Arabic elite culture. This was the thing that they were proudest of. They revived Hebrew and made it just as good as Arabic in the, writing of poetry, right? And that's, a thing that our culture is proud of. And how dare you, sully this by claiming that we're doing Hebrew wrong? And don't say that too loud because our good friends in the elites might hear, right? You guys following so far? Right? Anybody have any questions so far? Because we're going to get into Yehuda HaLevi. That's just a background about Andalusian history because Yehuda HaLevi comes to fame as a poet, I want you to understand how important poetry is. Okay? So Yehuda HaLevi, finally. Okay? Right. I was supposed to delete that. Okay. So he's born in 1075 in Christian Spain in Castile. Okay, it's actually unclear where he was born. Some say Toledo, some say Tudela, right? The important thing for our purposes is he's born in Christian Spain, which makes him a hick. He comes from a backwater, like the guy who's going to become his patron, Moshe ibn Ezra. Later in his life, he's going to have to journey through Christian Spain. He's like, these people, they don't know poetry, they don't know science, they don't know anything, right? We don't know much about his early life. And I was talking to a friend of mine looking over this. It's like, yeah, we don't know much about the early life of like anybody back then. Like it's just the thousands. Like we don't know, right? So we don't know much about his early life, but apparently he got an education, which is weird kind of because he was from Christian Spain, which wouldn't have given him the same opportunities. But again, the boundaries are sort of permeable during this time, right? It's unknown if he ever got smicha. He appears to have studied in the yeshiva in Lucena, and he appears to have been friends with the Ri Magash, who ended up becoming Rosh Yeshiva there. But he may have cut his yeshiva short. His yeshiva stay short to become a patron of Moshe ibn Ezra. All right. So by 1090, he is in Granada, probably, though there's a lot of debate about this because do the math. 1090 minus 1075. How much is that? Oh, you guys were like, oh, I'm going to a Jewish. I didn't know I had to do math. It's 15, right? So like a lot of the sources I've seen start debating his birthday for a variety of reasons. Also about when he reaches middle age, whatever. But like a lot of the stuff that I've seen is like, well, by the time he gets to Moshe ibn Ezra, he's too good of a poet to have been just 15. I don't think so. First of all, like he had a gift. Second of all, like we know that they educated their kids in poetry pretty young. The Andalus in Al-Andalus, the ideal age was to teach kids poetry was like 10. Some of the like Shlomo ibn Gabriel died really young. Right. I don't think it's out of the realm. Like he was just that good, right? So he is a patron of Moshe ibn Ezra. So how that happens? So I sent you guys an email. I don't know how many people saw it or take a look at it. Okay. So there seems to be some debate in the sources as to how they met. I was like starting the research and I wanted to give you guys something to read. So I sent you guys that. But like, so the calling card letter and response I sent out as an email. So Halkin says that Moshe ibn Ezra actually didn't respond. And I'm not sure where they argue, but I am going to go with Halkin because he has a better story. And I'm being transparent about that. I'm being totally transparent about that. This may not be true, but whatever. It's a better story, whatever. Okay. Not sure who to believe, but Halkin's story is better, right? And it's based on a letter that HaLevi wrote bragging to a friend. So basically what happens, according to this account of events, is that there's a guy, Yosef ibn Sadiq, who had gotten a letter from Moshe ibn Ezra in a particularly complicated poetic structure, right? They like once you have a art form and you play with it enough, it becomes, especially poetry, becomes very complicated, and you start showing off how complicated it can get, right? And part of the whole game with these salons and with these like circles is that, oh, top this, right? So Yosef ibn Sadiq gets a letter from Moshe ibn Ezra with a very complicated poem. And he's like, oh, crap, how do I do it? Like, how am I going to top this? So he's sitting at a bar, essentially, with his friends going like, I got this poem. It's really good, but I need to respond. I don't know how I'm going to do this. And there's a newcomer at the bar, according to the way that Halkin tells it, right? There's a newcomer from Castile comes to the rescue, right? And we know this from a letter in which he later described the scene to an acquaintance. He wrote, making music on the wine cups one night. I love that detail, right? Picture some wine cups like, right? With some songs who were endeavoring to compose, and he overhears like a bunch of people trying to write a poem, right? It was addressed to their commander-in-chief. And to be brief, I made a good start on the poem's first part, but after continuing well, my companions soon fell into such a confusion that they cried, what you've started, please end. I replied, God forfend, how can I add one more line with these poor skills of mine? So he's like, look, I think I can do this. And then he starts writing and they're like, oh, wow, that's good. He's like, really? Do you think this is good? Like, yeah. Right. And they're writing to Moshe ibn Ezra. And he eventually finishes this poem that not only like matches Moshe ibn Ezra's skill, but like doubles back and does it backwards and heels, right? Halkin has like a whole analysis, and he prefaces it with like, if you're not into like analyzing poetry, just skip the next couple pages. And I tried to stay with him, but like I was in a hurry. I probably should have read this book a week ago. Whatever. I read it yesterday. So he sent it to Moshe ibn Ezra and like signed his name at the end in like, a poetic way of doing it, right? Because it was really supposed to come from Yosef ibn Sadiq, but he hints at the end like, you wanna find out who really wrote this? It's me, right? So, like using the same meter and rhyme as Ibn Ezra, he begin by high-spiritedly boasting of having parsed the text before him and banished the intrusive voice of propriety that its author had complained of. Whatever. I'm not going to do the whole analysis, right? So he lives with and is patroned by Moshe. I don't know what the verb form of that is, right? So Moshe Ibn Ezra takes him in as this like young kid with talent, right? Because that's what Moshe Ibn Ezra is able to do as the vizier figure, right? He's the dean of the he's the head of the Jewish community. He's also the dean of the poetic circles. He's like, this kid's pretty good. Let's bring him in. Let's support him, right? So he's taking part in all these wine and poetry parties, and he's doing well at it. He's good. He's talented. He's like, people are amazed at how good he is, right? Very Hamilton, very kind of that same feel of like, this new guy has got something and we don't understand what it is, but he's so good, like that kind of feel to it, right? At this time, around this time, Granada's invaded by the Almoravids, right? So remember how I talked about how there's like Muslims invading during this time, who are like looking at these settled Muslims and going like, you guys got soft and you guys didn't, you guys are not oppressing the minorities enough, right? So one of these, they're actually welcomed into the city to fight the Christians, and then they're like, but then why do we need you as the ruler of the Taifa? So like, they're from Morocco, they come in. This is not the last group that's going to come from Morocco doing this, right? So Moshe ibn Ezra is out of a job, and because he was part of the power structure before, right? So he leaves the city and he takes on the life of a wanderer, going throughout the north and complaining about how uncultured they are, right? Without a patron, Yehuda HaLevi also leaves. And this is also a period of wandering for him. He seems to like have gone where he was needed. Okay. So I just want to say that I just want to like, this is in the introduction to in the copy of the Kuzari I have in print. This is in the introduction. I do want to say this, right? Those were his happy wander. Yeah, I guess that means wonder years in German, because like it's an academic going like, let me say it in German, right? And they were spent according to the fine civilization of the age, not merely in absorbing Jewish learning in the regular Talmudic schools, but in assimilating everything he could of the science and philosophy which Arabic culture had to offer, cultivating the poetic arts in both Arabic and Hebrew, fraternizing with young men of like gifts and inclinations, and frankly enjoying life. Like he was living the good life as you know, an elite in the Arabic is Jewish culture of the golden age of Spain. This is where I love this paragraph just because it's so like bold, especially this was written like the 50s. The love poems of his youth, it may be said in passing, are certainly not academic exercises in imagined passion. Love was in the mores of his time for the members of his class, and while native fastidiousness may have led him to avoid the profligacy characteristic of the rich of his class, the tenderness and sensuousness of his love poems are too authentic to allow any doubt of the realness of the experience. Um, I I I I like to sum this up in like a one word sentence, in like a 2-word sentence, but like this is being recorded, and I shouldn't say profanity in a recording. Whatever. Okay, so this is an example of a love poem that he writes. Okay, and this one is like intensely genuine. Halkin sort of points to this as the moment that he becomes a great poet. Right? So, Malachat Sivya Timni Tzirayach Midod Silav Malut Tzirayach Lo Tedi Ki Ein Ledodech Mizman Bilti Shemo Akol Shlomotayach. Why, my darling, have you barred all news from one who aches for you inside the bars of his own ribs? Surely you know a lover's thoughts care only for the sound of your hellos. Goes on for like a long time. I couldn't copy and paste the entire poem in here, right? Notice something, by the way, the rhyme scheme, right? Ayach at the end of each line, right? So Halkin points out that like besides for being a rhyme, it sounds like a cry in its own way. It also kind of sounds like a echa in its own way, and it's also like where are you, right? This is basically like why'd you leave me, right? And you know, Halkin goes like, we don't know who this person was, who he wrote it for, who apparently like really got to him, right? And that's one of the great things about history. We don't know what Yehuda HaLevi got up to during those times. He wasn't writing all about all the, you know, affairs we had. Like I was having a debate with a friend who I had posted about this on Twitter about, and he's like, how dare you imply that Yehuda HaLevi, you know, was you know, a liar? I'm like, what do you mean? Like, you know, presented himself as a guardian of the tradition, but like, you know, got up to this stuff. Like, first of all, he never lied about anything, because later on in his life, he's going to talk about like, you know, I wasted my youth in the lusts and desires and whatever. And second of all, like he was a human being. Like human beings do things and have heartbreak and loss and all these and like do things that they're not supposed to do. It happens. Even the greatest among us have had their times where they were not, you know, that are not part of their official biography, right? Uh, one of the reasons I find him so fascinating. He's the most human of the people that we have, in our tradition. Right. So anyway, so Yehuda HaLevi travels around to Lucena, a town that was mostly Jews and had a yeshiva. HaLevi had possibly studied there. At that point, the town had been forced to pay the Almoravids war debts. That should say Islam instead of Christian. The Almoravids were not converting them to Christianity; they were converting them to Islam. That would have been quite against it. Yeah, whatever. I should proofread. Okay. So this shows you like the place that Jews were in the society, right? Like they were rich enough to be powerful when they were next to power, but then like, you know, the invaders come in and it's like, give us all your money or else we're going to force you to convert, right? So there's a yeshiva there led by his friend the Rimagash, who taught the Rambam's father. Next he goes to Seville. So he finds a patron there who pays his bills, but he hates it there. Like in his letter, part of like the whole deal of patronage is that you're like writing poems about how great your patron is every so often. So one of his poems, he's like, look, I love you a lot and you are the best, but everyone here sucks except you. You are good. I like you. Not everybody else. They suck. Right. So he makes a living during this time. He writes bespoke poetry because he's good at it. And if you're having a wedding and you want to like have somebody say something at your wedding, like that's a good way to spend your money, right? So we have like these sort of generic wedding blessings and funeral stuff. This is also when he starts writing liturgical poetry, because like to an extent, to a degree, that is much more than today. Prayer was a performance. Even now it's a little bit of a performance, but when like the text was a little bit more malleable, like you could insert piyutim introducing like certain prayers. So there we have like a whole stuff, like, and a bunch of the stuff gets incorporated into some of Sephardi Sidurim. A lot of these piyutim get like purged over time, but whatever, because it's less fun when you have to read it than when you are performing it, whatever. Okay, so he goes to Toledo. Just to check, am I boring anybody yet? I'm usually not this blunt with my students, but like you're paying for, some of you are paying for this. Just like making sure you're all with me. Okay, so he goes to Toledo in Christian Spain. Why would you go to Christian Spain? Why would you go to like backwater where all the hicks are if you are, this cultured, even seen as like the most outstanding most outstanding representative of Andalusian Jewry? Why would you go to backwater Christian Spain? Because there was a opportunity for employment, for an opportunity to be employed. Basically, this is something which is kind of crazy if you think about it. The church banned anybody in the priesthood from becoming a doctor or learning medicine. Okay, that doesn't sound so bad, from our perspective, because that's what medical school is for. But like, there was no other university than the thing that trained priests, right? There was nothing. There was no medical schools, right? So basically, Christians didn't have doctors for the most part. And the way that you became a doctor in the world, this part of the world at the time, is you read some books, you put your sign out there that said, "Hey, I'll try to cure you," and if you did a good job, people talked about it, and that's how you became a doctor. Different times, kind of, sort of. Right? So Yehuda HaLevi became a doctor in Toledo, and he was successful in terms of money, but he's very cynical about medieval medicine, which is one of his more endearing qualities. Is Yehuda HaLevi seems to have an awareness of like, all this medieval stuff is BS, right? He's like, we're not curing anything. We're doing a pretty bad job of this. Halkin speculates, based on the fact that there's a couple of poems about dead kids. I should phrase that better. There's a couple of poems lamenting the loss of a child in Yehuda HaLevi's Irv. Am I pronouncing that correctly? That it was his kids. I'm not so sure about this, but it could be. And he speculates that the reason why he's so cynical about medicine is because his own kids died, even though he was a doctor. But I don't think that's it doesn't strike me as the reason. I think the reason is because he taught himself, and he was like, I don't like, it just seems natural to me to go like, for him to go like, yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing. But I'm doing my best out here. He becomes kind of pretty successful. He seems to have made some investments that have worked out. He's a leader of the community. He's still doing the poetry. He's there's a bunch of letters that were found in the Cairo Geniza about a whole thing where a kidnapped girl was ransomed, and he helped organize the ransom for that. So that's what the head of the community usually does. So he lives there 1108 to 1130-ish, right? There's a pogrom in 1109, which happens between kings. It was actually a queen and then a king. But like, just goes to show you the precarious place of Jews in the medieval era. Like, once there's like a power vacuum, and there's reason to, like, to uprise against the the remnants. The once the Jews no longer have the king's backing, it's open season on them, right? So, like, what you see in Yehuda HaLevi's life, which is going to become important when we look at the Kuzari, is the degree to which even the biggest success in the societies that he lived in was always a misfortune around the corner from getting wiped all out. Even in his happiest days in Granada, right, in 1090, it was just 30 years after a massacre there, right? So he going back and forth between Christian and Muslim Spain, and being the other in both societies, and seeing the precarious place of the Jew in both societies, like, that was a big part of what leads him to write the Kuzari, right? So a lot of what was interesting when researching this is a lot of the sources about Yehuda HaLevi, and like describing his intellectual evolution, describe what he goes through as a midlife crisis. Okay, because he seems to look back on his youth with a degree of regret, and then dedicate himself to to the big things that matter, right? So, like, let's look briefly at this. This is a poem that I shoehorned into this entire thing, right? Adonai negdacha kol tavati imvenlo lenal sifati, right? This is like a religious poem. This is not meant to be liturgical even, but this is just like expressing his religious ideas, or his religious longing for God. We could like spend all day like looking at like what this says about like where he's at, but I'll just point out, just in terms of his biography, right? My young years thought of not save themselves, when will my world-sated soul save itself, right? He looks back on his youth doing all this, poetry and wine, and, contests of clever youths, trying to impress other clever youths, and maybe trying to impress a lady or two, or maybe a boy, right? And he's like, what was that for? What did that accomplish, right? I'm getting older, right? Like, I'll be honest, there's a little bit of me that was like drawn to this in its own way, because I'm 34 now, right? But that's part of the timelessness of it, I guess, right? But again, for those people who deny that like Yehuda HaLevi actually did anything, like trying to find, by my lust for my youth to my wane, right? Let's see if that's what the Hebrew says. This is something I should prepare ahead of time, instead of making you wait while I scan these lines for, because with rhyming translations, it's never whatever. Okay, whatever, take my word for it. Okay, so as the years went by, and what's causing this, right? Like, what he was doing in his youth was doing what was expected of him as a Jewish youth of talent in Iberian Jewry, which was be sophisticated, be cultured, write poetry, but also do your religion, right? And he maybe looks around at the world he's in and goes like, and what did that get us? Just, we've identified with like the powerful aspects of the society that we're in, and like those people chew us up and spit us out at the first chance they get. Like, here's from the introduction to the Kuzari here, right? As the years went by, however, and he witnessed one Jewish community after another going down in destruction, as was caught between two fires in the advance of the Christian armies, a new light dawned on him, which he gave expression in a new type of poetry, an insight which found mature and conscious formulation in his later and most powerful poems and the great prose work of his closing years. This insight that whoever won in the struggles of the Reconquista, Israel was bound to lose. That although some powerful court Jew might find protection for his people in the north as they fled their burning homes in the south, such asylum would be merely a refuge built on quicksand, slowly ripened into conviction. That's good writing. That's Henry Slaminsky in the introduction to the Kuzari. If you find an old copy of the Kuzari, I like you can get this online somewhere, but like it's good writing there, right? Okay, all right. So like what interests me there personally is the way in which he, and maybe this is me projecting or whatever, but like with the Kuzari, everybody's projecting themselves onto the Yehuda HaLevi. So why do I need to be rigorous or scholarly? No. But like the degree to which he identifies the trappings of the elite culture as like rooted in power. And how like, but that's not really what all this is interesting to me. And I think something whatever, we'll see more about, right? Okay. He starts having dreams. And dreams are, you know, in all eras of human history, seen as significant. Right. And he has a dream of, dream of like Hagar's son ceased to scorn the son of Sarah higher born, for in my dream you were undone, has your doom so son begun. Right, then the year 4, right, he starts having like these prophetic dreams about like the downfall of the Muslims in Iberia, right, which is going to happen like 500 like 300 years from now, but like it's going to happen, right? This is like, you know, about the culture that the elite of his society so, you know, tried so hard to identify with. And he's saying that like, no, they're the people keeping us down. Right. Right. And like he's again, like that paragraph said, like his poetry starts realizing the place of the Jew in both Christian and Muslim societies is one of an other. Right. And as long as we are strangers, as long as we are, you know, part of a minority here, like as long as we are not autonomous, right, there is definitely proto-Zionism going on in the Kuzari's thinking, right? But this is a famous poem, right? Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'sof ma'arav, eich et hama et asher elcha ve'ech yarav, right? My heart is in the east, but the west will be far in the west, right? The west, like one thing I wanted you to notice in the email that I sent out was that like the West in Moshe Ibn Ezra's worldview is like, and you know, coincidentally in our own worldview is like where sophistication happens, right? And then you know, Yehuda HaLevi is coming from the east, from Christian Spain, right? And Yehuda HaLevi is saying that like, yeah, I'm in the West. I'm at the end of I'm in the like. I want to write an article like applying all this to today's environment, and I have a title in mind called Yehuda HaLevi and the End of the West. But like how the rest of me far, like how my heart is in the east and my and I am the end of the west, but like the rest of the poem is saying that like I am caught between moor and cross, right? I'm taught Tzion bechevel Edom v'ani bechevel Arav, right? Edom, traditionally identified as Christian Rome, right? He's caught between Rome and Arabia, right? And gladly, Yakel be'enai, azov kol tu sfarad, kamo yakar be'enai, ra'ot atfrot devir necharav. Gladly I'd leave all the best of grand Spain for one glimpse of the ruined shrine's dust, right? He's turned his back on the sophisticated culture that he grew up in, that raised him, that created him, that, you know, made him what he is, and says, this is all, you know, not ours. This is all not, you know, something we're, right? And I want to show you something. Like I posted this on Twitter the other day just because I found this really cool, right? Later in his life, he writes this very famous poem, which is now part of Keynote on Tisha B'Av, right? Sion hala tishali l'shlom asirayach dorshei shlomech v'hem yeser adarayach miyam mizrach mitzafon v'seman shalom rachok v'karov se'i mikol avarayach. Right? Sion, will you not ask after the welfare of your prisoners who seek your welfare, the remnant of your flock from west to east and from north to south, the welfare of those far, right? Anybody recognize that rhyme scheme? Remember that love poem he wrote earlier in his career, right? That, like, you know, we talked about as seeming to be like very genuine. We see how he's taken the youthful, you know, desire and emotion and passion, and he's taken it and like reshaped it to be something larger than just his own individual struggles, right? The analogy I ended up coming to, like, when talking out with myself on Twitter the other day, is like the love poem represented a wound, and this is a scar built on that wound, but that's the scar that is, you know, part of our tradition, which I find so fascinating, as like, you know, the relation between like individual struggle and like what becomes, you know, part of, you know, Jewish tradition. Whatever. This is just something I find interesting, right? But we see how like he's matured to take his like youthful, you know, feelings and, you know, apply them to not just himself, but to the plight of the Jewish people in general, right? It is within this crisis, this midlife crisis that I've been talking about, that he writes the Kuzari, right? So in a letter in 1129, he says he's finished a draft of the Kuzari, but he's probably not done with it, because he says, yeah, I wrote a book. It's called the Kuzari. Some people have been asking me questions, but it's garbage. Right? He asked me about certain matters, sent the book to him, later repudiated it. When we meet again, you'll see it, right? Open question as to how much of what we know as the Kuzari is in this edition of the Kuzari. Halkin argues that he probably like expanded on it and like revised it, and I'm inclined to agree. Whatever. I mostly read Halkin, whatever. So in 1130, he returns to Arab Andalusia, to Cordoba. Okay. And during this time, remember how I said before about like there's always these like the settled groups of Muslims are, you know, getting relaxed, and then the you know the Muslims coming from Morocco, from the North Africa, are like, right. So the Almohads are making the Almoravids nervous. The Almohads are like really fanatical. They are, in fact, going to end the golden age of Jews in Spain when they expel all the Jews from Spain. This is where the Rambam comes from. This is where Ibn Ezra comes from, right? The Rambam is expelled from Spain, goes through North Africa. There's good reason to believe that the Rambam faked converting to Islam with his along with his family, but that's like a whole other conversation, right? Ibn Ezra is expelled from Spain during this time. He is sort of the spokesperson for the golden age of Spain in the Jewish tradition in a lot of ways. You know, polymath. I should mention him and Yehuda HaLevi may have been from the same town, may have been related by marriage. Nobody's quite sure, but he does quote Yehuda HaLevi sometimes in his commentary, right? But in addition to the Almoravids, who started to become more chill, and now the Almohads are like, why are you becoming more chill? We're invading, right? Christians are on the march as well, right? So Yehuda HaLevi has returned to the place of his youth, the place of the golden age of Spain and his own golden age. And he finds that it's ending. And this is why I think that he revised it, right? The Kuzari is written in a place of knowing that this is all going to collapse, right? Knowing that all of this is almost over. I don't want to say, look around you, but hopefully hopefully things, but like, right? Okay. Anyway, but I do want to point out something which I found interesting in like the debate about Yehuda HaLevi, because there's this one author, I forgot if it's he or her or first name, Menokal, writes a book like writes a book about Al-Andalus and Muslim Spain during this time, and writes about how it's a golden age and how it's a golden age of like tolerance and everybody got along. And one of the things that's like a little bit controversial about her book, I think it's a her, is that she kind of portrays Yehuda HaLevi as the villain. What do you mean? Right? Ornament of the world, Menokal, right? He chose to leave it all, to abandon the culture that had made this poetry possible. He repented not merely for himself, he also denounced a culture. His culture, which he saw as decadent, and he wrote treatises against the very poetry they had once brilliantly composed and performed. Like, maybe we'll get to this, maybe we won't in the Kuzari, but like one of the things that he says that is so controversial to, Iberian Jewry is that, yeah, we shouldn't have adopted Arabic meter. We shouldn't have adopted, Arabic grammar. We should have let Hebrew develop on its own and develop which is weird, especially because he's writing in Arabic. And also not just because he's writing in Arabic, because that was his entire career until that point, right? He turns his back on everything that made him, right? HaLevi's defection caused disquiet and discomfort among the vast majority of Jewish intellectuals and literati of the 12th century, most of whom took for granted that civilized people like themselves, and unlike so many of their unwashed Christian and Jewish neighbors to the north, could, as a matter of course, do things like read philosophy in Arabic and recite reams of poetry in Arabic, and more recently in Hebrew too, if they were Jews. The mostly hagiographic accounts say it was around the time he was 50, around 1125, that Yehuda HaLevi, scion of this great culture, declared that it was all folly and inimical to Jewishness and had to be forsaken, in spirit certainly, and if possible, as he intended to do, physically. People were astonished and some of them were offended. Now, I think that this presents both an accurate and an inaccurate picture. Because I do think that what Yehuda HaLevi was doing was rebellious and radical in turning his back on the society that made him and saying all those ornaments of high culture and all those identifications we made with the power structure were not really Judaism. They were just what we did. And I want something more real, right? But was this really, like, part of the criticism of this book is that it presents a sort of mythic picture of, society under Islamic rule, everybody getting along. There is some anti-Zionist, stuff involved in here as well, in terms of like the way that she presents Yehuda HaLevi. But like the thing is that he wasn't coming from a place that was foreign to Jews of that era. And I'll explain why. Okay. Remember, so the Kuzari, the book that we're going to do, right? It's presented as a dialogue between a king who is unsure of what religion to convert to, and a rabbi who convinces him to convert to Judaism, right? This was based on a thing that actually happened, a Khazar kingdom in Khazaria, which is where Khazars live. It's in Central Europe. It's on the steppe. They're steppe peoples, right? And these rumors about a kingdom that had converted wholly to Christianity, Judaism, had been circulating for a while. It's a bigger world back then, and things make their way across trade routes and we'll see in the next slide, right? So now the Khazars, did they convert after a conversation with a rabbi? Probably not. They converted probably because they realized, hey, the Christians want us to convert, and Muslims want us to convert. Why don't we do neither, so we could play them against each other? They got wiped out eventually because it's a dangerous game. All right. But anyway, sorry, I'm running out of voice here. Right. Remember Hasdai ibn Shaprut, the guy who started Hebrew poetry and it was like the first of these vizier positions, right? who's in many ways the founder of Golden Age Jewry in Spain. So he sends a letter, and it was actually written by Menachem ibn Shaprut, who like sort of signed his name in it, but whatever. Menachem ibn Saruk, not Shaprut. I know you all care very deeply about getting that right, but whatever. Right. So sent a letter to the king of the Khazars. Right. I, Chazdai, son of Isaac, son of Ezra, belonging to the exiled Jews of Jerusalem in Sfarad, servant of my lord the king, bow to the earth before him and prostrate myself towards the abode of your majesty from a distant land. I rejoice in your tranquility and magnificence, and stretch forth my hands to God in heaven that he may prolong your reign in Israel. Right? Notice tranquility. Right? Like, I'm not... Should I read this right? He's basically talks about like how word reached him about like this kingdom of Jews, kingdom of Khazars, right? Right, and basically talks about like men are our confederates and are honored by us. There's communication between us by embassies, mutual gifts. They are very powerful. They maintain numerous armies with which they occasionally engage in expeditions. When I heard this report, I was encouraged. My hands were strengthened and my hope was confirmed. Thereupon I bowed down and adored the God of heaven. Right? Because part of, even at the height of their golden age, or the beginning of their golden age, finding out about a kingdom ruled by Jews in which Jews have autonomy and are not at the whim of the culture around them is enough for Chazdai ibn Shaprut to send a letter on the slim chance that it might be true. Right? Even at the height of the golden age, autonomy and freedom of oppression was the dream of even the most well-off Jew. Even the vizier, even the second of in command to the king or whatever, most powerful Jew around, hearing a little bit about like Jews that don't have to be afraid, that aren't despised by and at the whims of the people in their society. Please tell me more, right? Yeah.
Can I add a quick
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd call it a fun factoid, but it's not super fun. Basically by the time this letter would have made it to, if I'm remembering the timeline right, basically by the time this letter would have made it to the Khazar kingdom, it only had about another 20 minutes left, and then it was gone.
And there is a response that is of doubtful provenance.
Simon Shama's somewhere in the middle of part 1 of Story of the Jews has a really, really good long stretch about both about the Dunash Menachem, that, and about Chazdai ibn Shaprut's thing.
Did I do it justice?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Thank
Absolutely.
you. Thank you. Thank God. Okay. Anyway, so going back to this. So remember when you said that I would rather, see the dust of Israel, of the Holy Land, than be in the end at the end of the West, right? So puts his money where his mouth is. He goes 1140. Yehuda HaLevi leaves Spain for Israel. He stops off in Egypt, is welcomed and honored by the community. We know about this from the Cairo Geniza. He's one of the Rishonim whose handwriting we have as a result of the Cairo Geniza, which is a fun fact, right? So he makes his way to Israel, and we used to not know if he made it. We now know, thanks to the Cairo Geniza, that he did make it to Israel, but he died there pretty soon after getting there. Legend has it, and we don't have any competing tradition, that he's trampled by an Arab horseman as he bent down to kiss the ground of Yerushalayim, which is it's always been a bummer of but maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, but there's something poetic about it, I guess. Do I have another slide here? No, I don't. Okay. So that's the context in which Yehuda HaLevi writes the Kuzari. The thing that I want you guys to pay attention to as we're reading the Kuzari is like, the phrase that comes to mind is like, master's tools, can never demolish the master's house, that whole phrase, right? to what extent, like, Yehuda HaLevi is very much in the Kuzari trying to demolish the master's house, right? A question that we should ask is, to what extent is he able to free himself from the master's tools in doing so, right? He wants something realer, and he wants something that is, and we're going to talk about this when we actually look at the Kuzari. Like, he wants something that speaks to what Jews as Jews can contribute, right? And not taking from other cultures, not like borrowing from other cultures, but like what do we actually believe? What do we actually have? So to what extent can he really free himself of the person that he was raised to be is, I think, a important question. And also, like, what is he rejecting? I don't know. So that's enough talking out of me. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more. Here's what I have in mind in terms of what I could send you guys to read so we can then discuss. Okay? So let me go to my Safari account. How many people are still with me here? I can't check. Whatever. Okay. So I made... Okay, so this would be what I would send you guys in an email, either as a PDF or as, going to Safari, right? I would send you something that would have you ask you some questions to keep in mind while reading the entire thing, right? So read all this and then ask yourself, what motivates the Khazar king? What is he looking for? What is his initial attitude towards the Jews? And in this section of the text, meaning like the entire thing, what things are claimed as universally true that are only particularly true? I don't know if that question makes sense, but hopefully by the time you read it, it'll make sense. Okay. And then for each thing, for each of the guys that the Khazar is going to consult, he consults a philosopher, right? And then I have questions for understanding. This isn't homework. This is just like, here's what the questions you should be asking yourself to make sure that you understood what you just read, right? So according to the philosopher, what should be the primary goal of human beings? And why does the Khazar reject the philosopher, right? And then the Christian, right? So this is what I would send to you guys. You would read this and, just make sure that you've read and understood. I don't need you to actually answer the questions. This isn't school. This isn't homework. I'm not grading this. Just be ready to, discuss, right? And then we'll have a discussion based on the questions for discussion. Like, is there a common theme to the ways the Khazar dismisses the other guys? I couldn't think of a way to describe like the philosopher, the Christian, and the Muslim other than the other guys. I don't whatever. Okay. What is Yehuda HaLevi rejecting by making the basis of Judaism what he makes it here? Does that relate to how the Khazar rejects the others? Do you think that Yehuda HaLevi is fair to the traditions he dismisses here? Why or why not? Does anybody, how do people feel about this being a reading, for lack of a term, assignment that I send you guys to do by the time we meet next? And I'm gonna stop sharing, unmute, like, everybody good with this? Like,
Sounds good to me.
I'll be honest, I don't know if we would actually finish the Kuzari by this in this way, or like if we should even try. And maybe I should just do selections from it. I don't know. I'm sort of feeling it out, but I think that this would definitely be a good start, and we'll see how it goes from there. Okay, how do people feel about this class and what we've learned today? You guys can say words. I'll even turn off the recorder.